Rain had been falling for days in the hills. Water pressed silently against the dam. When it broke, there was no time to run. The hills of western Pennsylvania were wrapped in mist. For days the sky had not shown its face. Rain fell in steady sheets, thin at first, then heavy, then thin again, never stopping. In the valley below, Johnstown stirred with the rhythm of an ordinary morning. Steelworkers trudged to the mills along the Conemaugh River, their boots sinking in the soaked clay. Children splashed in puddles as they ran to school, laughing beneath the low gray clouds. Women carried baskets of bread and milk down narrow wooden sidewalks, skirts wet to the knees. No one imagined that the soft patter of rain could become the sound of approaching ruin. The Conemaugh River was already swollen. From the steep Allegheny ridges, streams poured in like restless veins. Logs drifted by, bits of fencing, even a dead sheep. People watched from the bridges, shaking their heads, but with the calm acceptance of those who had seen floods before. Johnstown, after all, was a valley town. It had always lived with water. Yet this rain was different. It had begun 3 days earlier and refused to stop. Farmers upriver said the fields were drowning. Railwaymen reported landslides blocking the tracks. Still, the mills kept running and the trains kept coming. In 1889, progress had its own kind of stubborn faith. High above the valley, at a place called South Fork, stood the great earthen dam of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Behind it lay a private lake, the South Fork Reservoir, a playground for the wealthy men of Pittsburgh. They had rebuilt the old dam years ago, patched it with clay and timber, and lowered its spillways to make the lake deeper. Engineers had warned that the structure was unsafe, but no one listened. The dam had held before, they said. It would hold again. But on this gray morning of May 30th, the caretaker, a man named Elias Unger, felt the unease in his bones. He stood at the edge of the dam, staring at the frothing water climbing higher and higher. The rain hissed around him like steam escaping from a giant kettle. He could see where the current had begun to eat away at the top, where the waterline licked the edge of the earth. Down in Johnstown, no one knew. The telegraph lines were still working, but few messages came through. The newspapers spoke only of the unusual storm. Children pressed their faces to the glass, tracing raindrops racing down the window panes. A teacher in the Cambria schoolhouse told her class, half smiling, "It's only rain, it will pass." By evening, the sky darkened again. Thunder rolled over the mountains like distant cannon fire. The streets turned to rivers. Water ran through cellars, carrying coal and ashes out to the gutters. Men placed sandbags by the mill doors, swearing softly, thinking only of another ruined workday. But still, they did not fear. They had seen floods before, 1861, 1867, 1874, and each time the town had survived. That night, lamps flickered dimly behind curtains. Families huddled together, listening to the endless hiss of rain. Some prayed for it to stop. Others simply waited for morning. Above them, the dam at South Fork groaned quietly under the weight of 2 billion tons of water. Each drop from the sky joined a growing force that no one below could see. And still, the rain would not stop. At dawn, the rain was still falling. The clouds hung low, pressing on the valley like a heavy lid. Streams had turned into brown torrents, rushing downhill toward the river. In the mountains above Johnstown, the South Fork Dam trembled under the strain. Elias Unger woke early, though he had hardly slept. He could hear the rumble of water beyond the window of his small cabin. By the time he stepped outside, the roar had grown to a steady thunder. The dam, built of earth and stone decades ago, was now a trembling wall against a rising inland sea. He ran his hand along the damp surface, clay soft as bread dough. Everywhere, tiny rivulets were cutting new paths down the slope. The water level had risen almost to the crest. He shouted to his men, ordering them to clear the spillway. Logs and debris had jammed it tight, blocking the outlet that might have saved the valley. They worked with axes and poles, pulling at the tangled mess of trees and fencing. But every minute more debris came, rolling from the lake's surface, carried by the storm. The men were soaked to the bone, their hands shaking from cold and fear. Unger shouted again, "If we can't clear it, we'll have to dig another channel." But it was hopeless. The ground was too soft, the current too strong. At one point, a section of the embankment gave way, a sliver at first, then a muddy slide that hissed down toward the valley. Unger watched it vanish in the mist, his heart sinking. He sent a messenger down the mountain to the telegraph office at South Fork. The message was brief. "The dam is dangerous. It may give way." The operator wired the warning to Johnstown, but the lines were unreliable, the signals delayed. By the time it reached the valley, the words had become routine, one more alarm in a week full of them. In Johnstown, the mills roared louder than the river. Workers read the telegram on the notice board and shrugged. Rumors of the dam breaking had come before, and nothing ever happened. To most, it was just another story for a rainy day. Back at the dam, Unger's men grew desperate. The lake's surface was nearly even with the crest. Waves, whipped by wind, began to lap over the top. Each wave tore away a little more earth. The men shouted above the storm, their voices swallowed by the noise of water. By noon, the sky turned almost black. The rain fell in vertical sheets. One worker pointed and screamed. The center of the dam was sinking. Unger ran toward it, but the earth trembled beneath his feet. He stopped, staring in disbelief as the top of the dam began to crumble like wet sand. "The dam's going!" someone yelled. They turned and ran, slipping on the mud, their boots clawing for purchase on the narrow path. Behind them came the sound, not a crash, not a roar, but a deep, growing vibration, as if the mountain itself had started to breathe. A massive wave broke through the breach, followed by another. Then the entire middle section collapsed. For one long second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then it exhaled with a roar that shook the valley. The lake had been freed. A wall of water 40 feet high surged forward, devouring the trees, the roads, the telegraph poles. Horses broke loose from their stables, galloping wildly before being swept away. Unger stood frozen, powerless, watching the impossible unfold. The dam was gone, and below, 12 miles away, the people of Johnstown still had no idea. At 3:10 in the afternoon on May 31st, 1889, the South Fork Dam gave way. For a heartbeat, there was silence, a terrible, suspended silence, and then the sound that followed could be heard for miles. It was as if the mountain itself had torn open. The great wall of water exploded through the gap, rolling forward in a single massive surge. It gathered speed with every yard, dragging trees, rocks, barns, and entire sections of hillside along with it. 100 million tons of water burst down the narrow valley, devouring everything in its path. It was not a wave, it was a living force, dark, churning, unstoppable. At the village of South Fork, people heard the roar and looked toward the dam. They saw a wall of brown fury rushing toward them, taller than the rooftops. There was no time to run. In less than 2 minutes, the town vanished beneath the flood. Houses were torn apart like kindling, carried off in fragments. Horses screamed, fences vanished, and a locomotive, still steaming, was lifted off its rails and spun like a toy before it disappeared. Further down the valley, in the town of Mineral Point, the signalman at the railway station tried to telegraph a warning to Johnstown. He managed only one phrase before the wires went dead. "The dam has broken." Moments later, the station and everyone inside were gone. The wave moved faster than a galloping horse. It traveled at nearly 40 miles per hour, roaring through the valley's narrow walls. Each bend made it higher, more violent, more filled with wreckage. By the time it reached East Conemaugh, it had become a monster of mud, logs, and fire. There, a train was waiting, 2 engines and several passenger cars. The engineer, John Hess, saw the flood coming. He blew the whistle again and again, warning the valley below. It was the last thing he ever did. The train was lifted off the tracks and crushed beneath the torrent. From the hillside above, survivors would later say the valley disappeared under a black, moving shape. The water climbed higher than treetops. Each crash was a building, a bridge, or a life. Farmhouses disintegrated in seconds. Cattle, wagons, and people floated together in a sea of debris. 12 miles below the dam, Johnstown stood in the heart of the valley, unaware. The rain still fell. The river was high, but the townspeople were busy saving what they could from flooded basements. Children watched from upstairs windows as barrels and wood planks drifted by. Then, from the west, came a sound, low at first, like distant thunder. It grew louder, deeper, closer. Someone stepped outside and froze. The horizon, once filled with rain, now boiled with brown and black. A wall of water taller than the church steeple was racing straight for the town. There was no time. A few people ran toward the hills, slipping in the mud. Others stood still, unable to comprehend what they saw. Then, in a single instant, the flood reached Johnstown. The first streets vanished in seconds, buildings shattered like glass. The Cambria Ironworks, a symbol of the town's industry, was ripped open. Molten metal hissed as it met the water, sending bursts of steam into the air. Whole houses were torn from their foundations, spinning together into a whirlpool of wreckage. Those who managed to cling to floating beams were thrown against bridges or pulled under by barbed wire and timbers. At the stone bridge near the center of town, debris began to pile up, a mountain of ruin. In minutes, it caught fire from overturned oil lamps and gas lines. The flood became a river of flame. For hours, the torrent raged through the valley, carrying with it everything Johnstown had been. When night fell, the rain eased at last, but it was too late. The town had become a vast lake of wreckage, burning and drifting under a silent, endless sky. When the floodwaters finally slowed, the valley lay in silence. What had been Johnstown, a proud steel town of families, factories, and churches, was now a wasteland of mud, fire, and broken timber. The air smelled of smoke and oil. Somewhere in the distance, a bell was ringing, but no one knew who was left to hear it. The torrent had passed, leaving behind a lake 2 miles wide. Where houses once stood, there were piles of debris stacked 30 feet high, a tangle of wood, iron, and the lives of thousands. In places, only the tops of telegraph poles showed above the water. The church steeples were gone. The schoolhouse was gone. The main street was gone. As the rain eased, survivors began to move, dazed and bleeding. They climbed from roofs and trees, calling out names into the thick mist. Some shouted for their children. Others simply whispered prayers. There were no answers. At the stone bridge, the wreckage had formed a dam of its own, a mountain of shattered homes, train cars, animals, and bodies jammed together so tightly that it blocked the river's flow. The water pooled behind it, and oil from broken barrels spread across the surface. When night came, a single spark, perhaps from a lantern, ignited the slick. The bridge burst into flames. Those who had survived the flood watched in horror as the wreckage burned. Somewhere inside that mountain of debris, hundreds of people were trapped, alive, calling for help. The fire turned the night sky red, a cruel reflection of the disaster below. Men tried to reach the bridge, but the current was too strong. They could only stand and listen to the screams fading beneath the roar of the flames. By morning, the fire still burned. Smoke drifted low across the valley. Bodies floated in the water. Men, women, and children tangled among beams and fences. Rescuers came in boats, pushing through the wreckage with poles. They worked in silence, speaking only when they had to. There were too many dead to count. In one field, a horse stood alone, covered in mud, trembling. A boy no older than 12 tried to calm it, his face streaked with tears. Nearby, a mother sat on the ground, holding the small hand of a child she could not wake. A priest walked among them, offering last rites to those beyond help. The valley had become a graveyard. At the edge of town, survivors gathered at the few buildings left standing: the Presbyterian Church, part of the Cambria Library, a single tavern. There they organized search parties and makeshift shelters. Blankets were torn into bandages. Wagons became stretchers. The injured were carried in by the dozens. Broken legs, burns, deep cuts, eyes swollen shut from the flood's debris. Doctors and volunteers worked through the night, their lanterns flickering in the dark. News of the disaster began to spread. The telegraph lines had been cut, but a few messages got through to Pittsburgh. One operator wrote, "Johnstown is gone." No one believed it at first. How could an entire city vanish in an afternoon? But as survivors stumbled down the rail lines, the truth arrived with them, drenched, shivering, speechless. By the second night, rain returned lightly, washing soot from the ruins. The smell of decay grew stronger. Men walked through the mud, tagging bodies with scraps of cloth and laying them in rows along the hillside. Women lit candles beside them, shielding the flames from the wind. There were no words left to say. The flood had lasted less than an hour, but in that hour, more than 2,000 people had lost their lives. Families, entire neighborhoods, entire generations gone. And the survivors, standing among the ruins, could only look to the blackened bridge, still smoking, and wonder how the world could ever be the same again. In the days that followed, Johnstown became a city of ghosts, but also a city of courage. The water had receded, leaving behind a wasteland of wreckage and silence. Everywhere, survivors moved like shadows among the ruins, carrying what little they could salvage: a photograph, a piece of furniture, a child's shoe. The smell of smoke and death still lingered, but so did something else: the stubborn will to keep going. The first to organize were the mill workers. They gathered along the rail yard, forming teams to search for the missing. With shovels and bare hands, they dug through the mounds of debris. Every discovery brought both relief and heartbreak. Sometimes they pulled out the living, weak, bruised, but breathing. Other times they found only stillness. In one corner of town, a group of women set up a kitchen under a tent made from torn canvas. They boiled what little clean water remained and baked bread on iron stoves salvaged from the ruins. Soon hundreds came, hungry, cold, silent. The women served each person by hand, never asking names, never stopping to rest. They worked by lantern light, through rain and wind, their faces pale but determined. Among the rescuers was a doctor named William Lohman. He had not slept since the flood. Moving from patient to patient, he cleaned wounds with whiskey, stitched torn flesh with thread pulled from his own coat. When his hands began to shake, he tied them with cloth to keep working. "Not today," he whispered to himself, "not while they still need me." There were other stories, quiet acts of heroism lost to time. A young teacher, Mary Young, formed a chain of survivors to cross the current and save 3 children stranded on a roof. A telegraph operator stayed at his post, sending the last messages from Johnstown until the rising water reached his knees. 2 miners used ropes from their carts to pull a dozen people out of the flood's edge. In the face of ruin, humanity found its voice again. Word of the catastrophe reached Pittsburgh, then Washington. Newspapers printed front-page headlines: "Johnstown destroyed, thousands dead." Donations poured in. Within days, trains began to arrive, carrying food, blankets, and volunteers. The Red Cross, newly established in America, sent its founder, Clara Barton, a woman whose name would become part of Johnstown's story forever. She was 67 years old, thin, steady, and fearless. When she stepped off the train, the survivors fell silent. Clara Barton walked through the ruins, taking notes, counting the injured, planning the relief. She built shelters, distributed supplies, and comforted the grieving. Her calm voice carried through the chaos like a prayer. She stayed for 5 long months, long after the news had faded from the nation's headlines, until every survivor had a blanket, a meal, and a chance to begin again. The Red Cross tents became symbols of hope. Inside, strangers helped strangers. Widows cared for orphans. Men who had lost everything still found the strength to carry bodies from the wreckage so that others would not have to. One night, a mill worker named Thomas Burke found a small child sitting alone beside a broken bridge. He lifted her into his arms and whispered, "You're safe now." He never learned her name, but he carried her to the relief camp and stayed until she smiled. The valley that had been filled with screams was now filled with voices of comfort. There were prayers at night, songs sung softly by candlelight. The people of Johnstown had lost their homes, their families, their history, but not their humanity. Even in the shadow of the deadliest flood in American memory, they built something new: compassion. And when Clara Barton stood before the survivors one quiet evening and said, "We will stay until you no longer need us," for the first time since the rain began to fall, someone in Johnstown smiled. Summer came slowly to the valley. The air grew warmer, and the scent of wildflowers began to rise from the blackened earth. But Johnstown was still broken, a scar carved deep into the hills of Pennsylvania. Where streets had once echoed with the sound of hammers and laughter, there was only silence, interrupted by the clatter of wagons hauling debris away. Yet, amid the ruins, life began to move again. The first sound of rebuilding was the steady ring of hammers. Men stood on the mud-soaked ground, driving nails into boards salvaged from wrecked homes. Children carried buckets of water to mix mortar. Everywhere, people worked with hands blistered and hearts still heavy, determined to bring the town back to life. The Red Cross camps had become villages of their own. Rows of white tents lined the hillsides, each one filled with survivors trying to start again. There were carpenters repairing tools, women sewing cloth from donated cloth, and soldiers unloading crates of medicine and food. Clara Barton moved quietly among them, checking lists, speaking softly with the sick, comforting the ones who had lost everything. She refused to leave, even when her health began to fail. "This work," she said, "is not finished." The federal government sent engineers to clear the Conemaugh River. They used ropes, cranes, and dynamite to move the mountain of wreckage that had gathered at the stone bridge. When the fires were finally extinguished, the true scale of the loss was revealed. Thousands of bodies were recovered, many unrecognizable. Burial teams worked day and night, marking graves with wooden crosses and simple numbers. For each, a prayer was whispered, gone but not forgotten. As weeks passed, the town began to take shape again. New houses rose from the mud. Temporary rail lines were laid to bring in supplies. Local businesses reopened in tents and sheds. One shopkeeper painted a sign that read, "We are still here." That phrase became the heartbeat of Johnstown's recovery. Children returned to makeshift schools built from old timbers. A young teacher named Sarah Finch stood before her class of barefoot students, writing letters on a blackboard rescued from the flood. Her voice trembled only once when she wrote the date, September 1889. She paused, then smiled softly. "We begin again," she said. Churches held services in the open air. People gathered on Sunday mornings to sing hymns of hope. The songs carried over the valley, broken voices rising into the sky. Some cried as they sang. Others simply closed their eyes, letting the wind carry the music upward toward those they had lost. By autumn, the first permanent houses were finished. Smoke rose from chimneys once again. The clang of hammers gave way to the rhythm of trains returning to the valley. Steel production resumed at the Cambria works, smaller now, but alive. And in the evenings, lamps glowed from the windows of rebuilt homes, the quiet proof that Johnstown had endured. Clara Barton and her team prepared to leave. Before departing, she gathered the townspeople beneath a large canvas tent. Her voice was weak but steady. "You have suffered beyond words," she told them, "but you have shown the world that courage is stronger than disaster." When she finished, the crowd stood in silence. Then someone began to clap, slowly at first, then louder, until the sound filled the entire valley. In the months that followed, the story of Johnstown spread across the nation. Donations continued to arrive. Books were written, songs were composed, and artists painted scenes of the flood and its aftermath. It became more than a tragedy. It became a lesson in endurance. Out of destruction, a community had rebuilt itself. Out of despair, a kind of peace was found. When the first snow fell that winter, the town was quiet once more. Smoke curled from the new chimneys, drifting into the pale sky. The Conemaugh River, once the destroyer, flowed calmly again, reflecting the lights of a city reborn. And though the scars of loss remained in every family, Johnstown stood, not as it had been, but as proof that even after the darkest storm, life finds its way back.
Years passed. The hills above Johnstown turned green again, and the scars on the valley floor began to fade beneath new streets, new homes, and new lives. Children who had not yet been born when the flood came grew up hearing the stories whispered by their elders, stories told quietly, with the weight of memory. By the turn of the century, the sound of hammers had been replaced by the hum of streetcars and the whistle of trains. Factories once more poured smoke into the sky, and the mills glowed red at night. To the world beyond Pennsylvania, Johnstown was alive again, an emblem of recovery. But to those who had seen the water, who had heard the roar of the mountain bursting open, the memory never left. Old survivors often gathered near the stone bridge, the place where so many had died and where the flood had finally stopped. They would stand in silence, listening to the river that once destroyed their town, now flowing gently beneath them. It was strange, they said, how peaceful the water seemed, how innocent. But they remembered what it could do. Each year, on the last day of May, the townspeople lit candles along the riverbank. Children floated small wreaths of flowers into the current. For a moment, the water shimmered with soft light, not from fire, not from destruction, but from remembrance. The candles drifted past the bridge and into the darkness, carrying with them the names of the lost.
In the courthouse square, a monument was built, simple stone, engraved with the number that no one would ever forget, 2209. It stood not as a symbol of tragedy, but of endurance. People came from other towns, other states, to lay flowers and to stand in silence. Some cried. Others simply placed a hand upon the cold surface and whispered a name known only to them. Time softened the edges of the story, as time always does, but the lessons remained. Engineers studied the flood to build safer dams. The Red Cross grew stronger, learning from what Clara Barton had accomplished in Johnstown. And across the country, people began to understand that nature, for all its beauty, demands respect. For the survivors, life was never again the same, yet they built something lasting from their pain: community. Neighbors became family. The people of Johnstown learned to look out for one another, to share bread, to share hope. When new storms came in later years, they watched the river carefully, but without panic. They knew fear, but they also knew strength. An old man once said, standing before the monument, "We were washed clean that day, not by choice, but by fate. Everything we were was taken, and what remained was only what mattered." He looked toward the hills, where the new homes gleamed in the sun. "The flood didn't end Johnstown," he said softly. "It began it anew." As dusk fell over the valley, the air grew still. The sound of the river mingled with the faint laughter of children playing in the distance. Somewhere a church bell rang, marking the hour, and for those who stopped to listen, the echo of the flood could still be heard, not as thunder or destruction, but as a heartbeat, the heartbeat of a town that refused to die.